I'm Julie Passarelli. I'm the Exhibits and Collections Curator here. I'd like to also introduce one more person. In the back of the room, we have our librarian, Cecily Thomas. She has put together a nice spread of books from our library and articles, reprints from our library, most of which are written by our speaker, who it's my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Christine Whitcraft. Dr. Whitcraft is an associate professor in the biology department at California State University, Long Beach. She earned her bachelor's degree in biology from Williams College in Massachusetts and her PhD in biological oceanography from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego. Her main research interest is coastal wetlands from a multidisciplinary perspective, including plant, algae, and benthic invertebrate biodiversity, food web structure, physical environmental parameters, and economic perspectives. She teaches a range of ecology classes at CSULB, including wetland ecology, plant ecology, and conservation biology. Outside of research, Dr. Whitcraft still can't get enough of wetlands and serves as the president of a local nonprofit, Friends of Colorado Lagoon, and is also on the board of the Bolsa Chica Conservancy. The title of tonight's talk is Designing Solutions to Restore Wetlands in a Time of Change. Please help me welcome Dr. Christine Whitcraft.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, everyone, for attending. It's always exciting on a Friday night that people want to hear about wetlands. Also, thank you to the Friends for supporting this, to AltaSea for supporting this, and to the Cabrillo Aquarium. So not only is this aquarium full of people that I love to work with, but they also are a lot of Cal State Long Beach alums, which always makes us excited to hold events here and to work with the staff and the students that work here as well. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into a talk tonight where I talk to you about wetlands. Part of it is a narrative about why I love wetlands, and I hope in the beginning I can take that moment to convince you why you should too, though if you're here on a Friday night, you may already. But I also can't start a talk without taking a moment to thank all the people that do this, work with me and collaborate with me on the ideas. So we call it the Wetland Workout Plan. A lot of the work that we do is heavy lifting, both in the sort of project design phase, the policy and management implications, and sometimes just the stuff that we move around. And I do that with a suite of collaborators from all sorts of different institutions, universities, a suite of funding from various sources, as well as fantastic undergraduate and graduate students. So for many of these students, this forms the backbone of their master's thesis, and they are usually assisted by a suite of undergraduates. All of them are passionate about, conserving this environment and just really getting muddy. So I'd like to start the talk by acknowledging all of their hard work in making this project happen. The two students, Kaylin and Marjorie, are the main authors on the two studies that I'm going to highlight tonight. But with those details aside, I first wanted to just bring you to the world of wetlands. We usually get into biology or any sort of field because you love it. I grew up in the Chesapeake Bay, where wetlands are a little bit larger than they are out here, sorry. But there are places where they're just teeming with life, and you can't always see all of that life. They're beautiful landscapes. This is the Huntington Beach wetlands, where you can see large open channels directly next to the beach or across PCH from the beach, wide expanses of mud flats. There are other wetlands like this. This is the Tijuana estuary, right at the US-Mexico border, a site of controversy partially because of the impacts of the surrounding area to this place. But it's a spectacular place with plants, large mud flows, lots of organisms that use it as home. And these environments are by definition special. So I always ask audiences, or groups of students, what's your best definition? What's the simplest definition you have for a wetland? And they're all thinking it, but no one wants to say it's land that's wet. But that's exactly that definition has a lot of meaning. So being land that's wet means it's different than what I call upland. So that's land that's not wet. And being wet means that it has different sediment, it has different organisms that can live there, and it has different plants that can live there. They're all adapted, in the case of the coast, to a salty, wet environment. They're also adapted to the tide coming in and out. So this is a time-lapse video of a wetland near Bahia de Los Angeles in Mexico. And it shows that not only are these plants adapted to living, these plants and animals adapted to living in wet conditions that would kill your average houseplant to be in the bathtub, say, for 12 hours a day, right? These plants and animals are adapted to that, but they're also adapted to being exposed to air half of the day. So these are intertidal, fully saline and salty coastal wetlands. So what you'll watch in this time-lapse image is the tide come into a wetland at low tide. And so suddenly all those organisms that were adapted to living in the air have wet roots. They have oxygen-deprived roots. They have non-consolidated soils, and they're adapted to that as well. So for me, part of the fascination of wetlands is not only are they beautiful, but they host these animals and plants that are adapted to really specific conditions, and somehow not only live there, but thrive there. There are some of the more charismatic and beautiful animals that people go to see. So this is the snowy egret at Bolsa Chica that one of my students took. And then there's examples of state and federally endangered species that live in the wetlands. This is the Belding savanna sparrow that uses our wetlands, needs plants to perch up high. This is an example of a federally endangered species that's a wetland obligate. It's the Ridgway's rail, or formerly known as the light-footed clapper rail. These guys require certain plant heights to be able to support their elevator nests that go up and down with that tide. With the loss of coastal wetlands, we've seen the endangered species of the endangered status of this species develop. There are also commercially and recreationally important species that are wetland obligates. If any of you like fish tacos, you've probably had California halibut. This is a species that without wetlands doesn't have a nursery habitat for its young, the smaller fish like this. This is a well-camouflaged adult halibut. But despite all those beautiful and amazing things that we know about wetlands, we didn't always feel like it was true. If I had scary music, I would cue it now. The Swamp Thing was a movie that was based on the idea that these were insect-ridden, pretty smelly places that might just suck you down in, or worse yet, if you wore your white, you might get it really dirty. And so that attitude towards wetlands led to the conversion of these to more useful habitats. There was a swamp buster bill in the early United States history that paid people to convert these useless habitats into something better. And unfortunately, what that led to was a rapid and long-term conversion of coastal wetlands and other wetlands to developed areas, to diked and bermed off areas, to harbors and marinas. This is a map based on about 1896 T-sheets along the coast, mapped by USGS, where you can see the historic extent of the wetlands overlaid on the modern aerial imagery. And you can see that the Southern California coast in our region was dotted by a series of relatively extensive coastal lagoons. The Wilmington Lagoon is now the ports of LA and Long Beach. Alamitos Bay is one of the sites that now hosts a Marine Stadium and a lot of the Naples Island in Long Beach. Anaheim Bay, I'll talk about today. Bolsa Chica has gone through both degradation and restoration, and Upper Newport Bay is one of the sites I'll talk about today. But the story we see with a lot of these wetlands is true around the coast and even globally. There's been a dramatic loss in area of these wetlands as we failed to recognize how valuable they were as habitats. The estimates in California range between about 80 and 90% loss of our coastal wetlands. And if I paused my talk here, that would probably be very depressing. But the question that we like to ask in the lab is a very applied question. Not just how much loss have we had, but what do we do about it? How do we best do restoration to bring these habitats back? And how do we do it in the face of climate change? So how do we restore wetlands when we have increased pressures from sea level rise? So now I'm going to quickly give you a 3-slide crash course in climate change, which I'm sure that many of you are familiar with. But the first part of climate change is that we have increased CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, and those have been measured through time. So this video that I'm about to show you starts with modern data collected by Ralph Keeling, known as the Keeling curve, that measures concentration of CO2 in parts per million in Hawaii. And you'll see that there's an upward trend. But what it does is go backwards through time and show you just how dramatic that increase in CO2 percentages are in the atmosphere. So here you can see the increase, annual cycles, increases through time, overall increasing amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But if you put it into perspective from other data that includes ice cores, tree rings, deeper ice cores, you start to realize that what we were looking at before as an increase is nothing compared to the historic increase that we've seen in CO2. And so what are the consequences of that? Well, the consequences for that increasing CO2 that we've described and related to human activity are an increase in global temperature and an increase in the amount of ice that's been melting from the glaciers. We've seen an increase in both the area that's been lost in those glaciers and the rate at which it's been lost. The largest chunk of ice that they had measured through time has broken off within the past couple of years. We see those effects in some cities around the globe. So I chose Venice because I had a fantastic boondoggle trip as a graduate student to go work there, because it was a city that was already experiencing the impacts of sea level rise. In Venice, this is known as acqua alta, and the high tides already come over the walls and flood San Marcos Square almost every day. They've erected barriers that used to go up a couple times a year. They now stay there permanently so that residents can walk around without boots. So I'm not sure why you just can't wear rubber boots all the time. But so what does that mean for coastal salt marshes? Well, I consider coastal salt marshes to be sort of the canary in the coal mine for sea level rise. They're a habitat that we expect to buffer us from storm surge and to prevent erosion on the coast. But they're also going to be the first place to experience those higher sea level rises and storm surges. So again, as we think about restoring coastal wetlands, we want to restore them knowing that sea level rise is a factor. So this is a prediction tool from NOAA, where they use digital images of the coast to look at sea level. So in large floods, all of this green area is flooded. But with predicted sea level rise, you'll notice that there's large increases in the area that's going to flood along our coast. Many of what we have as coastal wetlands are potentially going to be converted to subtidal areas so that they don't have the plants and animals that we're used to seeing in our coastal wetlands. And again, why I titled the talk was Designing Solutions is that we don't just want to leave the wetlands in that drowned state. We want to attempt to provide solutions for those wetlands to move forward. So in a scenario where we don't have a lot of urban areas, which is some wetlands still globally have this more rural or less developed settings. This is the before level where you have all sorts of adapted species living within the mudflats and eelgrass habitat of the coast. And with sea level rise in a perfect world, they would just migrate landward, and we'd have a wetland just further back. However, in a lot of areas, that's where we live, right? So when we put development and homes right on the coast, this ability of organisms to migrate landward is restricted. They need homes, just not that kind, right? So we could expect that through time, this land would be able to accrete sediment or build upwards, but that's not always true in our highly urbanized Southern California estuary. And one of the prime examples of that is in what I called before Anaheim Bay, which is the location of the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge. This is a marsh that has still historic, here's the connection to the ocean, historic channels throughout that are still sinuous and twisty. There's development on the sides, but it's currently protected as a naval weapons station. And that has been one of those surprising partnerships where often military facilities are protecting natural resources by just not allowing us to be there. But this site is experiencing a significantly higher rate of subsidence than other Southern California marshes. So not only are we predicting sea level rise to come up, but we're predicting that the marshes are going to continue to sink. So in cooperation with the USGS, they've been doing elevation surveys of the marsh surface. So using very precise GPS measurements to describe a grid over the marsh plain and see just how high it is. And what you can see is this is our current, these are different sea level rise scenarios through time from 2010 until 2110. And these are different habitats. So you have upper transition zones leading to the upland, you have vegetated marsh in the green, you have mudflat, and you have subtidal in the blue. And under moderate sea level rise scenarios, we maintain a marsh until about 2080. Then we transition almost wholly to mudflat, no vegetation. If the sea level rise scenarios increase, in the worst scenarios at 166 centimeters, which is a realistic number, we lose most of our marsh habitat converting to subtidal at this site by about 2090. So we have been embarking on a project that is aimed at mitigating or slowing down this sea level rise increase. We're obviously not going to lift up the whole marsh. So we need to find a way to make sure that the animals that live there can survive at high tide. So these are photos from now of the clapper rail. So if you remember, I said that the clapper rail shown here builds an elevator nest. The goal of this nest is that it floats with tides so that by high tide, the bird still has its eggs on top of something that anchors it and it doesn't just float out to sea, right? But if the tides are higher than the plant heights, they can lose all of their nests. And in these scenarios, you don't see many plants poking up above the water. So they've built artificial nesting platforms that are tall enough and do support the birds, but that's no way to live as a bird, right? We'd ideally support natural habitat, not just artificial nesting platforms. So it adds an urgency to the story there. And so as part of a very large team, we have been working to try out something called sediment augmentation, which is literally just adding sediment to the marsh plain to make it taller. We've been measuring parameters about all that mud we've put on top with USGS. We've been looking at the plants and invertebrates and photosynthesis. We've been measuring the emissions of greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane. And we've been studying how those sedimentation rates have changed through time. And putting that together, we start to get a story of how we might be able to intervene and save this marsh from marsh drowning. So this is the site from the ground pre-augmentation. And you can see that there's a variety of plants and organisms. There's some habitat variety or heterogeneity, small ponds, little channels. And then we did what we call rainbowing, which it's pretty much the ugliest rainbow you've ever seen. But we literally spray mud from the sediment bank in a rainbow shape to augment the marsh plain. So you can see that that is just putting mud right on top of all the plants that are there. And we put on 10 inches of mud. That meant that the whole marsh raised up by 10 inches. And when we were done, it looked like this. You have relatively low heterogeneity. It's pretty much a flat surface. There's some plants that manage to hang on despite that depth of sediment. But we were curious, and we still are monitoring, what happened after this. Is this a viable strategy for a marsh like Seal Beach? This is a digital elevation model by USGS that shows the topography of it. And what you can see is this is the normal marsh surface, mud flat. And we managed to raise the elevation of that quite significantly. These were design treatments, and this was where the operator fell asleep and built us Mount Vesuvius. He left the nozzle on there for 35 minutes. Our plot was under there, and we just moved it because that wasn't happening anymore. But so we had successfully raised elevation, and then we wanted to know how long does that elevation gain stay around. So this is a chart that looks at surface elevation change in millimeters through time from pre-augmentation, where we have these very little change naturally, sediment application where it leapt right up and we had applied about the right amount of sediment. And then we've had some loss of the sediment. We've averaged out a loss of about 17 millimeters. Some of that is just subsidence from the weight of putting lots of mud on top, and some of it is washed off. But the good news is after that change, we still have a significant increase in height from where we started. And what does that mean? So this is a tide chart for a month, an average month that we pulled up. And we've shown the experimental site here with a higher height and our control site here in a lower height. And what it means is that that site is not inundated by the tides as frequently as it used to be. Only the high tides reach our augmentation or experiment site, which is what we were aiming for. Right now it gets very little water, but in the future as that sea level rise comes up and the land subsides, we hope it will achieve the proper elevation to prepare for sea level rise. But that has meant that we needed to monitor the biological factors to make sure that these plants were going to come back. My student Kaylin, who's pictured in these, was worried that part of her thesis was going to be, we just killed the marsh. I'm going to ruin the punchline a little bit, but we didn't kill the marsh. It's coming back. And what we've done to ensure that is to measure the plant and animal parameters that are interesting and necessary for marshes to function. So we looked at the cover of plants, what species were there, and their photosynthetic rates as an estimate of how well they were doing. We also looked at some abiotic parameters like temperature and salinity to see how stressful the environment was for organisms trying to make a home there. In addition, partially because I love invertebrates, but also because they're the base of the food web, we looked at all the macrofaunal invertebrates in the sediment. So these are guys making burrows, crawling around the top, relatively small. We call them macrofauna, but when you look, they're pretty small. Everyone's macro is different, right? And they represent a variety of groups. We have marine earthworms, we have segmented worms, bivalves like mussels and clams, insect larvae, small crustaceans like amphipods, and flatworms. And we're evaluating them across the whole site. So we took those 3 habitat types we had, one that was dominated by saltwort or bottis, the pond habitat, and one that was dominated by cordgrass, and we chose sites. So we call this the headless dinosaur. That's our experiment site. And these are the pants. That's our control site. Because I'll direct my students, I'll say, well, go to the head of the dinosaur, right? It's right there. And we evaluated these parameters in all those plots throughout the site. And the goal was to see how it was recovering. The first thing we noticed was that when water was making it back on the site, we had started to restore the hydrology. We were starting to get that heterogeneity and the variety of habitats back. Despite it's looking like a moonscape initially, it was reforming the sort of elements that make a diverse community and food web. Though we still had, so this is a long-term temperature graph through about a month of the experiment and control. And I just zoomed in to show you. So for the most part in the experiment, which is here in the blue, the temperatures in the experiment during the day in the soil were higher. That makes sense. There's no plants to block the light. The sediment is receiving the full sunlight. So conditions were a little more stressful in terms of temperature. And we also found that partially due to evaporation and partially due to that increased temperature, this is salinity in all our different treatments. And basically you can see that these tall gray bars in our post-augmentation and the orange bars in our post-augmentation are much higher salinity. So we had a more stressful environment on that sediment surface. Without plants, they got a lot of light, increased temperature, and increased salinity. And I didn't even make a graph to show you this. So 1 month following augmentation, we had no plants, meaning that the plant cover had significantly decreased. And through time, we saw that actually the pond habitats reformed, and we had the same habitat there. At 6 months after treatment, we got our first cordgrass to come back. And we have started to see at a year and a half after treatment that all of these plants from the edge margin are starting to creep back into the site. So we're getting recolonization of the site by plants. That means that some of those harsh conditions of high temperature and high salinity will be reduced or ameliorated by the presence of the plants as they slowly colonize. So that's the beginning of the transformation back that we hope to see. We also had some rare species that we didn't necessarily expect to come back, the annual pickleweed popping up throughout our site at about a year after, which we were excited to see. So it meant that there was some ability of seeds to recolonize the site. The last thing we did was to use an in-field photosynthesis meter, which measures how much CO2 a plant takes up. You clamp onto the leaf with a small little chamber, and it measures the CO2 drawdown. That gives you an idea of how well plants are photosynthesizing. And we found that actually the plants on our experimental site at 3 different locations were photosynthesizing way more, actually, than our control plots at the same time period, which we chalk up to potentially the plants are not as muddy because they're not getting inundated. Potentially they don't have competitors around them to shade them out. But regardless, the fact that the plants are colonizing and that they're photosynthesizing well provides optimism that these are going to come back and more rapidly colonize the site. And what did we find in terms of invertebrates? So I will interpret the graph, but I'll also, a picture says 1,000 words. So these high bars in blue are all the pre-augmentation numbers for the experiment in these 3 and the control in these 3. And this is in-faunal abundance within our cores. So all of these were a diverse, relatively expected suite of invertebrates in the marsh, and they pretty much disappeared. Even up to 1.5 years or 2 years following augmentation. When we would sieve out the sample, our dishes would look like this instead of this. So we'd seen a rapid decrease in the number and species richness of invertebrates within the marsh. And who's there? That's the next question. We don't want to just know how many are there, but we also want to know who's there. So these are all of our communities pre-augmentation by percent. So they're a relatively diverse suite of organisms with lots of marine earthworms, which are shown here, lots of segmented worms, the polychaetes in the orange, lots of shrimp-like amphipods, and some insects. In the sites immediately following augmentation, these are all dominated by those dark bars. Those are our insects. So why do they come back first? They're typically aerial. They can fly onto the site. They're not relying on the tides to carry the young onto the site. And they tend to come to places early in succession. But the good news is that we consider them an early successional species and they're starting to come back. The bad news is we don't quite have a diverse community yet. So what's going on? We know what sort of works in the marsh community. Here's our regular marsh. It's inundated by tides. It tends to have low oxygen and sulfide stress, but it gets a regular supply of invertebrates. It has high organic matter, high decomposition rates relative to the other side of the marsh, and lots of nutrients available for plants to grow. But on this side of the marsh, where we're having trouble bringing things back, we have really different conditions. One is the tides just don't make it up there. They make it up there sometimes, enough to make those puddles and pools, but it has really altered water movement. That means that because it's not covered in water, it tends to be very aerobic, have lots of oxygen. It doesn't have a lot of invertebrate supply, though. So we were curious, were we finding this lack of invertebrates because of these differences, or was it also that this mud was super sandy? So one of the challenges that we had was that not only did sometimes the operator leave the spray in the same place for a long time, but they put a lot of sand on the marsh. And so when you walk in mud, we've all been there, these are boots sinking way in. It's sticky, it's full of organic matter, it's full of microbial material, it has lots of nutrients. But when you're walking on sand, this is a much larger grain size, it doesn't hold as many nutrients, it doesn't have the same microbial community. And so we didn't know whether the differences we saw was that we had raised the marsh, or whether it was that we had put the wrong type of mud on top of the marsh. So my student did one more experiment, Students love that. I just want you to do one more small experiment, and then you can graduate. But Kaylin was a trooper, and she went along with it. And basically, we tried to test whether it was this increased height that changed that inundation regime, or whether it was the difference in grain size that caused us to have differences in the inverts. Another reason I love ecology is that you can do simple experiments like this. So we went out and bought these very technical Ziploc containers from Pavilions. We cut the bottoms off and glued a little bit of mesh to the bottom. And then we filled them with mud or sand from the site that we'd frozen and unfrozen enough times that we had removed all the critters from it. We put them back out in the field in both the augmentation site, we just placed them in the ground, and in the control site. And we went back to check to see who came in to those newly defaunated cups. We checked at 2 weeks and 6 weeks. And if you remember, we had already said that the temperature was really different and the light was really different on the experimental site. So we were simultaneously testing all sorts of elements of it. And what we found was not what we predicted at all, which students also really like. Here's invertebrate abundance in our control in our experiment. The mud's in blue and the sand's in orange. You have it at September and October, but the results are fairly similar. Basically, we saw that in each treatment, there was no difference between our grain size. The mud was colonized at approximately the same rate and type of species as the sand, and it was colonized way more in the control than in the experiment. In fact, throughout the experiment, you saw an increase in the number of organisms and the species richness of organisms in the control, as you'd predict, but no increase in the experiment. So we interpreted this a little bit to be that these just weren't getting the same larval supply. We also asked who was coming back. And this is a graph where each one of these points represents one of those little trays that we put out. It's all the critters within it. And this is very different than this point. So difference between them is represented by distance. And what we could see is that a lot of our early ones were dominated by those insects. And through time, they developed in the control more of our earthworms, amphipods, and segmented worms. But it was by location, not by sediment type. So if we came back, we said, well, invertebrates seem to be able to colonize the sand. So our having put sand on the augmentation site doesn't seem to be slowing down the invertebrates. It seems mainly have to do with the fact that that site is just so much higher, the tides aren't coming on top of it. So if I came back to what we were talking about in terms of my marsh model, again, this idea of regular inundation in these sediments seems to be driving some of the differences we had between the two marshes. And so it's not necessarily the sediment type, which is in some ways a reassuring answer because we planned for the marsh to be higher, but we didn't plan for it to be sandier. So, and we also couldn't take off all that sand. We can't undo it. So we were, pleased to think that this sediment difference isn't going to be slowing down the recovery of the marsh itself. So we are going to continue to monitor these same parameters over time. So the data I showed you today are about a 1.5 to 2 year time frame where we've seen very slow recovery of some of the parameters. But we're starting to see the beginning of plants, invertebrates, and other factors coming back. We're also going to take half of the site and actually actively plant to bring back those plants faster. Because we feel as if we could bring back the plants, we'd lower the temperatures and salinities, and we'd speed up the colonization of some more of the invertebrates. But the good news that we tend to tell is that this is a dramatic strategy, and managers can't assume that you should do this everywhere. But it is a viable strategy in the scenarios where you have federally endangered species relying on the marsh, and where they're experiencing such high potential sea level rise rates. It is another tool in the toolbox that we can use. And the other project I'm not going to give you in as much detail, but there are ways to use marshes and other ones to protect shorelines too from sea level rise. So I've talked about it from the perspective of we expect marshes to experience high sea level rise. But we also expect homes and development behind marshes and behind seawalls to experience sea level rise too. And so there's a couple ways you could combat that. You could build berms, or you could build seawalls. And those are static built structures that will protect homes. But there's an alternative that wetland ecologists and managers have been thinking about, which is to build living shorelines. To use the features of marshes, seagrass beds, oyster beds to mitigate that sea level rise. So in these living shorelines, what you'd do is you'd have healthy marsh habitats like mudflats, oyster reef, and tidal marshes that would help lower the wave height as they passed over it, meaning that these inland developments would experience a lower sea level rise than those that had non-intact habitats. So I often argue, if you don't care about marshes, you do probably care about wet basements, right? So you can use marshes to prevent some of the sea level rise impact on land. And so what we've been doing is exploring with how we can bring back oysters. There's a native species of oyster, the Olympia oyster, that's native here to the West Coast. It was pretty much absent from all of the estuaries in Southern California, partially due to lower water quality, over-harvesting, and general changes to the estuary flow. But we've been working with a team of Orange County Coastkeeper and Cal State Fullerton to build oyster beds. So this is really the part of the wetland workout plan that's quite a workout. So we take a mud flat like this that doesn't have any structure, and we lay down a bunch of old oyster shell. In an ideal world, we get these from restaurants. When people order oysters, they get rid of the shells. And we're developing an oyster recycling program where they're going to donate their shell to us. Some of these we get from aquaculture farms as well. They are not the oysters themselves. These are the shells. We lay them down on the mud flat, and there's a chemical signature that helps young oysters settle on that hard substrate. So here the oysters can't settle because there's nothing hard. Here they don't want to settle because it doesn't have the same chemistry as an oyster shell. But when you lay down the shell, the little oysters want to settle on top of it, and you start to grow a bed. So what we've done in Upper Newport Bay is to have 4 sites where we are putting in eelgrass and oysters. And we're going to monitor how well they do through time. We have different treatments. We have oysters alone. We have eelgrass alone. We have nothing, the mud flat. And we have the 2 combined together. And we're interested in, do the oysters do better when they have eelgrass around? Does the eelgrass do better when it has oysters around? And how do these various combinations do at preventing erosion and wave energy from the area behind them? So we transplanted a whole bunch of eelgrass to these eelgrass patches, and we again laid down those big beds of oysters. What it looks like on the ground is taking lots of oyster shell and putting it in these, we call these coir bags. They're made of coconut, and they break down through time. But they're a lot easier to carry in a bag than a lot of loose shell. So we fill up these bags. We transport them to the site on various boats, trash cans, you name it. We drop them off at the site. We do a lot of construction in the dark because that's when the best low tides are. And the sun comes up, and you have a lovely constructed oyster bed. Already the birds think it's a great place to get their feet out of the water. And what we've been doing is really engaging the community in this process. Because it's one thing to hear that we want to create living shorelines, and it's another thing to have carried some of the 18,000 pounds of oysters down across a mud flat. If you guys have ever walked on a mud flat, it's not easy when you're not carrying 60-pound bags of oysters. So what we do is we stage a line. It's like a bucket brigade. People are standing in crates, so they sink slowly, and we toss oyster shell down the line and across to build these big beds. We engage high school students, college students, all sorts of volunteers, and the next day they really remember how good that oyster bed was. But at the same time, they also feel committed to being part of a solution to what seems like an unsolvable problem, right? Sea level rise often has that idea that we can't do anything to stop it. But this is a strategy where we have communities engaged, and we're educating them about how to use natural habitats to design solutions potentially to problems like sea level rise. And We've been exploring, how best do you do this construction? How deep should these beds be? How wide should the beds be? How far apart from one another should they be? And we've been monitoring the inverts that are in there. So in the very beginning, this is a response ratio of all invertebrates. Some sites, there's been no change. Some sites we had an initial loss because we walked all over the mudflats. We've seen species richness stay about the same. These are only right after the treatments. We've seen the community composition just change through time, but not dramatically decrease. So the good news is that the process of construction and laying all the shell down and walking all over the mudflat didn't kill all the invertebrates there. We also have been monitoring how fish use these habitats. So we can't really do traditional fishing techniques on top of an oyster bed. Dragging a net across a newly constructed oyster bed would just really unconstruct our oyster bed. So what we've done is deploy GoPros. So we leave these cameras in different areas focused on the reef, and we can see the critters that are using the eelgrass in the oyster beds. We see a lot more fish using the control zone in between the two beds, actually. And we're trying to figure out if that's just we can see better or what they're doing. But those are data that are sort of hot off the press for us. We just, counted, I think there's 500 hours of video that my grad student's going through, trying to figure out, who's using this. But the cool thing is that, there are critters using this. They're coming into the freshly created habitat, exploring for different organisms, this is a round ray, and using the habitat that we've set up. At the same time, our construction hasn't inhibited that, and we hope that we've gotten the community engaged in understanding how they can design adaptation strategies that work for both humans and ecology. And thus, then how we can use them to sort of have the more optimistic message about climate change and sea level rise, that we really want to preserve these incredible habitats for the future, and everyone can have a little bit of a role in it. And that is all I have. Yeah.
What is the relationship between eelgrass and the oyster?
So the oysters, sorry, I should have emphasized that more. The oysters filter a lot of water, and having clear water helps eelgrass grow faster because it can get more light through to the actual blades.
When I was growing up, eelgrass was something we wanted to get rid of. And now, I guess I've lived too long, now we're going to.
Well, and it is one of those challenging species. So, as a recreational swimmer, so her question was, sorry, I should have said, is eelgrass something that we've changed our views about and now we're trying to restore it? Some of the recreational swimmers, there's grass along your feet. It makes the water kind of murky because it's trapping nutrients and sediment and it's squishier. Eelgrass isn't a favorite for beachgoers, to be honest. But we've recognized now that it has such great habitat value. So it's creating all sorts of structure for animals to live in, invertebrates, and for the oysters, it has additional nutrients so that they're getting a lot more material to feed on.
That's a big
reversal. Yeah, and it's one of the choices. One of the things we thought about carefully in the shift is, you may not want to restore eelgrass habitat everywhere. You should be careful in your site selection of it, but it's now a habitat that's really protected in terms of what we can do with it. So, yeah.
One of the things with the wetlands that I've heard is that we've changed a lot of the natural freshwater influx into these habitats. So has that been part of your studies at all, or something you'd like to comment on? Right.
So his question is about sort of the sediment supply. One of the ways that a marsh can keep pace with sea level rise is to have lots of mud coming from a whole watershed down the stream and spreading out over the marsh plain. In Southern California, we have pretty much decoupled all of the rivers from a lot of the estuaries, so they no longer get that regular sediment supply. In the case of Seal Beach, the freshwater there is no freshwater input to that system. And what is there is what I call urban drool. It's not a nice stream channel coming in, it's running off from our irrigation, and it's there constantly throughout the year, but it's not these pulses that bring lots of mud. So we have really messed with the hydrology and the sediment supply. And we have been looking at that. The UCLA team has done really deep cores to see how through time we've changed the amount of sediment that's coming into the marsh. And the answer is, I mean, at Seal Beach, we've pretty much stopped sediment from coming into the marsh. Yeah.
Why is Seal Beach sinking?
So they are located, and I'm not a geologist, so this would be the layman's interpretation, but they are located, their position within the landscape is on one of the subsiding zones, but it's also been the site of oil and gas extraction. So the combination of the two has led to their really high subsidence rates. Yeah?
How much has been impacted, like fertilizers and all that, the runoff of the water? How does that affect the marshlands, the wetlands?
So her question was the impact of nutrient additions, fertilizer from the watershed. So it's variable. There's some places that are more agricultural than we are, say the San Francisco Bay Delta, that have a lot of impacts that come from fertilizers, where they see a change in the diversity of plants because the best nutrient absorbers grow the fastest and outcompete everything. They've seen offshore algal blooms. They've seen just a reduction in the clarity of water. We see a lot of runoff and pollution in Southern California too. Some of it is not the same nutrients. Some of it's more offshore where you see nutrients in the near shore. And some of it's just the type of nutrients that are different. Some of our marshes basically, when they have water supply, do have nutrient problems, but it's not as common as more agricultural ones, I think. Yeah?
You were talking about a native oyster species. Are they big enough to be profitable in the commercial business? I know Alta Sea is experimenting with offshore mussels and oysters. But are the native oysters commercial viable?
Yeah, great question. So my disclaimer is I know I work on oysters. I don't actually eat oysters. So someone who eats oysters can jump in. But the Olympia oyster is smaller. That's our native one. They apparently taste amazing. Has anyone eaten one? Oh, good. No one's eaten one. They taste amazing. And they apparently taste different. So there is a market for them from sort of the uniqueness. We do have a non-native, much larger oyster, which both are viable for aquaculture. They're both in the ecosystem. We're not going to get rid of the non-native one, most likely. So I know that there's proposals to try and harvest as many native as you can, but you also could do the non-native too. But people believe that sort of in the, oysters are a delicacy for the most part, and that you can get people who care about the taste, and so Olympia oyster might be viable, if we bring it up to higher densities. Yeah.
As another strategy for climate change, to mute the tides by saving current infrastructure like levees and so that you can regulate. We can buy a lot of time, maybe decades or that, to mute the tides so that you don't drown or make an area sometime. I mean, that could be as old as changing the entrance to Anaheim Bay and convincing the Navy not to let as much water, or at Bolsa Chica, letting the sandbar be across it so that you mute the seawater coming in.
I mean, I think that the challenges as sea level rise require more than just living shorelines. There's certainly built infrastructure that serves a purpose, or the resources are so important to protect that we need it right away without letting a living shoreline develop. I think the perk of living shorelines is that you get habitat restoration at the same time you get protection, and that the idea is, say, a breakwater doesn't increase in height unless we increase it, whereas an oyster bed is presumed they want to live at a certain depth, they're going to keep increasing their height to mitigate it. So in the long run, it might be, a self-sustaining solution. But I think when people look at, urban planning and coastal planning, their solutions include built and natural solutions as well.
A little of both.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're fighting a losing battle?
No. No, I mean, I think that if we look at the transition from what people have even changed in the time that I've been working on wetlands, our attitudes have changed towards it, and when people care about it, they do start to fight for those habitats. And so I don't feel like I I see the most change in my students, right? So many of them have never been to a wetland. It might look funny, it might suck their boots off, but by the end, hopefully, they'll have like a favorite wetland fish, or they've been to Bolsa Chica and seen a bird. And I think that does start to swing the needle as what people want to do with the coast. So.
We're going to do 2 more questions, and then Dr. Roy Kraft will go to the gift shop and keep answering the questions.
Sure. I saw you first in the blue.
Are there actually oysters that have started to grow on where you put it?
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to put it in because we just surveyed them on last Friday, but we have seen lots of baby native oysters all over the beds at Newport, which is pretty phenomenal. We also have small fish that are using the nooks and crannies in them. It was like a Navanax party, which is a sea slug, all over our beds. And so we really have seen the beds start to come back in an exciting way. Now the oysters are kind of little at this point, but they are all over the beds, and that's been really encouraging.
My name's Jeremy. I've got 4 5-gallon jugs in my car, and I was going to take them to the ocean and fill them up and dump them in the parking lot to stop the rise. Who's with me? I need 3 volunteers. This is after.
It's part of the wetland workout plan. Do you want to take the last one?
Thanks, everybody. This concludes our lecture. She'll answer your questions in the gift shop. We're
promise.
not done. So I'd like to thank you for an incredible lecture. I learned a lot. We have a small gift for you.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you so much.
Sure.
So let's give it up.
Thanks
for Dr. Kraft.
Thanks again.